All right, let's get into it. This is basically a rundown of current market conditions as it stands in January 5th, 2022. I expect this will change month to month, certainly maybe even week to week, depending upon. Market conditions are typically going to be based on the supply and demand within the market. So right now we still have a pretty short supply, and there's still a lot of buyers who are trying to get into the market, and so sellers have the upper hand. So there are some things that we can kind of do to be prepared. Now, something I want you to understand, it's not always required. It depends on how we go through the strategy. So this is individually case by case. This that I'm laying out here is a generalized, here's what we need to have in order to get started, and what you might expect, kind of more conservative worst case scenarios, and what we kind of need to do in order to be able to put our best foot forward. So without much putzing around for the rest of it, let's get into it. Okay, so let me draw your attention to this calculation right here. This is basically going to be an assumption on a few different parts, but the components and the keys are really kind of what it is we're looking at. And it primarily rides around your closing costs. So let's say, for example, if you're running a VA or an FHA, as a whole, they're going to be kind of similar in the way that we need to strategize because of the way the banks are going to operate. And so we're going to run with VA for now because the numbers are a little bit cleaner. But from a VA standpoint, if we're assuming an average house about 250, you don't have any down payment from a VA, FHA would be 3.5%. You've got your interest rate you have to take into account, 30 years, which is something I always recommend. There's a reason for that. Ask me about that later. And then, of course, you have insurance and taxes. So these are both assumed. Taxes can be higher. And it's not a perfect amount, but it's the components that we're looking into right now. So you've got a monthly payment, roughly $1,700 a month. That includes your mortgage, your taxes, and your insurance. That's a key number in this reason why we look at this. But primarily what we're concerned about, and when it comes down to the contract, is actually what you take to the table in terms of your closing costs. So in this particular application, closing costs are going to be about $8,000. My numbers usually tend to run a little bit high, so you can guess on the higher side it's going to be somewhere about $8,000. That's money that you need to be prepared for in cash ahead of time. At the current moment, most of the buyers, if you're walking into a house that's clean, that is relatively new, you're not likely going to end up getting your closing costs paid for by the sellers. That's just not the case anymore. Now, if the market shifts, sometimes we can ask for those closing costs, or we can build them into the loan. So, for example, they're asking $250,000. We could ask for $258,000 on the contract price. Then, in the contract, we actually build in those closing costs, so that then the seller reimburses those back to you, and the price that they actually get out of the house is $250,000. The problem with that is a couple different things. And the whole key behind all of this is to make you successful, we have to present the cleanest contract possible and basically take away as much risk away from the seller as much as possible. And so the risk of doing it that way, $258,000, and then building in the closing costs, is because the seller is obligated now to pay for those closing costs of $8,000, regardless of what the house appraises for. So the appraisal is typically out of our control. If the seller has priced the house properly, and we've done our due diligence and we set up a good contract price, if we're going over asking, then in theory, it should appraise for that. The bank is going to have someone, unbiased third party, come out and appraise the house, and they're going to give the bank's definition of what the house is worth. And so if it comes in short, let's say it only comes in at $250,000, we offered $258,000. Well, now not only do they not get their full asking price of $250,000, and they don't get the $258,000, which they were expecting, but now they're still obligated to pay your additional $8,000 because it's in the contract. So now they're less than $258,000. They're at $242,000. So now their risk is a lot higher because they're going to lose more money versus someone who comes in and offers $250,000 with paying their own closing costs. See how that works? So that's where we kind of have to feel the market. I'll give a really good example. Each house is different. There was 2 homes in the exact same neighborhood, very, very similar. One of them had a 3-car garage, was really clean. Both were about the same size. The other one was not so clean. It had some cosmetic issues like cracks in the drywall and things like that. relatively minor, easy repairs. It also had some really funky floors. Both were being asked for the same price. However, the one that had the 3-car garage was really clean, gone 3 days, off the market. And this is in a cooled market, by the way, not the crazy spring we had in 2021, which I do expect for spring of 22. But then the other market was sitting there for a little while. So there was a potential, it's not always the case, we do the homework and look into it, that we could ask for some closing costs, or we could maybe not have to go over asking, or maybe we could get some repairs done to the house, depending upon what the seller's financial situation is, right? So all these things have to kind of be taken into account. But as a whole, you want to be prepared with closing costs. In addition, you'll have an inspection on the property that is different, that is separate from the appraisal. And then you'll also have your option fee. So those two components, both of those, the inspection can cost you up to $500, maybe more, depending upon the size of the house. The appraisal, by the way, could be $500. So if the house does come in low, let's say it comes in at $225, and the seller's like, no way, we're not letting go for that. They can walk away. That's fine, right? You'd get your primary chunk of cash back, but you would lose your option fee, which we haven't talked about yet, but that's basically your unrestricted right to get out of the contract for any reason. It's a very good thing to have, but it also makes you less competitive. So we'll talk about that as we kind of go through. Those typically run about $250. You can go lower, you can go higher. Again, it depends on what we're doing with the house and the situation. Having no option is probably the most competitive, but it also leaves you with very little ways to get out of the contract without some other things happening from the bank side. So there's a risk. All told, you could have $500 for your inspection, let's say a $250 option fee, and then you have a $500 for the appraisal. If the whole deal falls apart at the very end, that's $1,250 that you're also potentially going to be out. So you're looking at pretty close to $10,000 right there as it sits. So my suggestion, if you want to be competitive in this market, you've got to be prepared with at least $10,000 cash. Now, you don't always have to put that up. We can make adjustments to the houses as we see it. This is primarily concerning VA and FHA. If we were doing conventional, it's a totally different ballgame. You're going to need your down payment for that anyway. We're looking at $34,000 for the same house at 10% down. Now, you can do even up to 3.5 on conventional, but it's more expensive. If you did 5%, it's a little bit less. Either way, this is something we would have worked out ahead of time, but you'll need to be prepared not only with that, not only with your down payment of 12 grand, but also your prepaids. So 5, another 8 there, basically, for your closing costs. So still another $10,000 in cash just to be competitive. Now, if you want to take it to the next level and really hammer it home, then you can come in with more than 10 grand. If you've got closer to $15,000, $20,000, then there are ways that we can make it more competitive. But there are also some things that we're not allowed to do from a VA or FHA standpoint, which is something you might have heard called an appraisal waiver. We're basically saying if the house comes in at a certain price point, then we promise we'll pay X amount above the house. We can do that with conventional. We can't really do that with FHA or VA. It's written in there. A lot of agents will say that they can, but if you read the contract, it states otherwise. So be careful with that if you hear that out there anywhere else. Either way, there are ways around it. There are things that we can do, but it would make you more competitive, because then if the house comes in low, the appraisal, which is what every single seller is worried about, then you can offer to basically pay the difference, or you'll have the capability of being able to pay the difference. And we can prove that through bank funds and things like that. So let's say it did come in at 225 and you still want to keep the house. The seller won't budge because they don't have to. They've got the power, right? Bargaining power. I always try to either get it to where you don't pay anything, or maybe we split the difference. We always try otherwise, but being prepared to have that capability is what will make you more competitive. And that's really kind of what it comes down to at the end of the day. Otherwise, we'll just keep spinning our wheels and we'll write contract after contract after contract. The other thought of that is basically then there's a $25,000 difference. somebody has to come up with that. If you've got that in excess cash, then you can get that paid for. But there's so many different ways to negotiate it as we kind of go through. At that point, maybe we can get your closing costs paid for and we meet somewhere in the middle or something else along those lines. So that's just a little bit about the market, a very, very short snippet about kind of how the contract works. It's probably something better shown to you visually that we kind of work through. But if you have any questions, reach out, send me a text, give me a call, and we'll talk about it then. Thanks. Bye.